Greetings, one and all. Welcome to another Naval History edition of the Proceedings Podcast. I'm Eric Mills, the editor-in-chief of Naval History Magazine. I'm glad you could join us again. We've got a really good one for today, a really good June podcast. It was 80 years ago this very June that the perils of World War II had reached just within a few hundred yards off the American coast. Beachgoers in the mid-Atlantic we're enjoying a nice sunny day, that mid-June day, and all of a sudden ships started blowing up right in their faces, right at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And here to talk with us about this is author Ed Offley, who did our great cover story a couple issues ago on Operation Drumbeat. This is sort of a follow-up piece. It looks at how Hitler's U-boat war started to take a dangerous new shift at this point in the war in 1942 in June. And the results of that were quite a shocking thing and a reminder to those of us today in this, what seems like these tempestuous times, this ball of confusion that is June 2022, that in June 1942, our grandparents and great-grandparents were facing a lot of things that we wouldn't even dream of, like Hitler's U-boats right within sight in front of them, blowing up ships. And so here to tell us this amazing story about the U-701 and her saga off the U.S. coast is Ed Offley to discuss his article in the current issue, When War Erupted Off Virginia Beach. Ed, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to see you again.
Good morning, Eric. Glad to be here.
Ed has written some wonderful books about the U-boat war. He's one of our best current authors on the topic. The Burning Shore, Turning the Tide, Scorpion Down. So we look forward to seeing more from him, but we're thrilled to have him in our pages again. This is a really unique story, and I feel like if people were in Virginia Beach right now, this very day, sitting on the beach, hearing this story, it would be hard for them to imagine this surreal image of just right in front of them, these ships blowing up, creating such a tidal surge that it's like blowing the beachgoers back out of the water. So I invite you to tell our viewers this remarkable tale.
Well, it's amazing in that it was a lost tale when I first started researching this 40 years ago, halfway. I was working at the newspaper in Norfolk, the Ledger-Star, and a couple of old-timers kept saying, there was this really weird thing that happened back in 42 where all these ships got sunk right in front of all the tourists on Virginia Beach. And I went back, and wartime censorship in World War II, we have no idea how strict it could be. You couldn't even broadcast a weather report without clearing it with the censors. But what happened was so blatant and so upfront and seen by 50,000 people that the censors allowed 1 day of coverage. There was one big banner headline day, and like most newspaper articles, there's the first rough draft of history. They got it all wrong. It's another story. But essentially what happened was there had been a 6-month campaign from the shores of Newfoundland to the Caribbean where the German U-boat force, emboldened by our entry into the war and yet the U.S. Navy's total lack of preparedness in defending, they came west, they came inshore, and from January to July, early July, both along the East Coast and in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, sank over 500 merchant ships, lost thousands of merchant marine sailors who were just as valuable as the ships because they were rare, and wreaked havoc. And one of the reasons the sudden inshore attack that happened on June 15th, 1942, I mean, nobody knew it at the time, but essentially it was the ending of that chapter. The U.S. had practically no effective defense against the U-boats when Operation Drumbeat broke out in January of 42. The destroyer group forces were stretched thin. Even those that were there were ill-trained in anti-submarine warfare, which is a very complicated and technical, tactical situation. The Army Air Force bombers spent most of January and February, dropping bombs on American escort ships they would see in the Gulf or in the water because they thought they were all German U-boats. So it was a bit of a one-legged ass-kicking contest for a long time. Over the 6-month period, in my opinion, the Americans did what Winston Churchill has famously said. He once said, you could trust the Americans to do the right thing after they tried everything else. There was a very steep learning curve. It was paid for in the blood of merchant marine crewmen and ships. But finally, by June of 42, they had actually created what they called the interlocking coastal convoy system. Now, a convoy seems like a very simple situation. You put a group of ships together going in a certain direction, surround them with escorts. It forces a solitary or even a group of German U-boats to come to you to do the attack. And there, if you got a well-defended convoy screen, the advantage is in your favor. For the first 6 months of 1942, these poor merchant ships were, say, getting oil in the Caribbean, down in Trinidad or Tobago or Venezuela. They came up across the Caribbean, around the Straits of Florida, up the East Coast, and the whole time U-boats were there waiting for them to pick them off. And what happened in June of 42, Admiral Karl Doynitz was the commander-in-chief of the U-boat force. His statistics and the reports from his captain showed him that the pickings were getting pretty thin along the East Coast. So he decided to do one last sort of slap of the wet towel in the face of the Americans. And he had 2 operations that went in on June 13th, 14th of 42. It was the night of the new moon, total darkness along the coast. He sent U-boats to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, the Delaware Bay, and Boston approaches Massachusetts Bay, while 2 other U-boats were coming ashore at the tip of Long Island and south of St. Augustine, Florida, to land 8 German saboteurs who were going to go around blowing up railroad bridges and things like that. It was a mixed result. The U-boat that laid mines in the Delaware Bay apparently missed the channel, and the only things they ever sank was a tugboat and a couple of barges. The fellow who tried to close the port of Boston, his mines, I don't even think he ever found them. He just dropped them somewhere and they're still there, all rusted out. But the German U-boat who was assigned to come inshore at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay scored a spectacular success. This was a guy named Horst Degen, 27 years old. It was his 3rd war patrol. So far he'd had I'd say an adequate but not a spectacular war record, mainly because of the situations he was in the previous cruises. First one, he was bedeviled by fierce stormy weather, which made it impossible to carry out any attacks against shipping. And in the second one, Hitler, in one of his fantasies in April of 42, he suddenly decided that Norway is about to be invaded by Britain. He pulled that out of his ears or whatever. And he ordered about a third of the U-boats in the Atlantic to go up and form a barrier between Iceland and Scandinavia. And so Horst Degen and about a dozen other U-boats spent a month out there just freezing to death. He caught a couple of small escort ships and sank them. But for this mission, it was pretty dicey. German U-boats, like every submarine, their only strength is in their ability to hide. And he was being sent inshore to water that was so shallow, he estimated that if he submerged on the bottom, the top of this conning tower would just be 2 feet below the surface. So anybody rowing by in a rowboat would say, hey, there's a German U-boat. But he being a good German naval officer, he carried out orders. They loaded 15 of these mines in his torpedo tubes. They were a third as long as a torpedo, but had twice the explosive warhead because they didn't need a motor or propeller or any of that stuff. So he had 15 of these things. He comes across the Atlantic, essentially tiptoeing across on one engine to save fuel. Gets close to Virginia Beach on the evening of June 13th. And he and his navigator worked it out. Instead of carrying out Doynitz's orders, which are pretty silly, Doynitz wanted the U-boat to go right into the Chesapeake Bay submerge to the bottom and hang around for a day or two, checking out how the ships were going. He saw that as a one-way trip to a POW camp, so they decided just to do it their own way. And so what they did was they headed for the Virginia Beach oceanfront, just straight in. You know, if he kept going, he was going to go right up on the beach. And about 200 yards out, his navigator looked up to the north, and you saw the two lighthouses of Cape Henry and Cape Charles. And he had figured on a chart when the two of them lined up in a single dot of light, that meant he was aimed right at the entrance of the Chesapeake Bay. So he executed a right-hand turn. He's on the surface, chugged along, got to the point where it's time to drop off the torpedoes, and this little patrol boat suddenly appears out of nowhere going back and forth across the channel. So instead of, hiding or submerging, he just turned off his loud diesel motors, turned on his electric motors that they use when they're running submerged, and kept going. And just kind of tiptoed around this little patrol boat, dropped 15 mines across the channel, and they all had timers set for 48 hours to give him plenty of opportunity to get out of there. One interesting footnote is, I first wrote this story in 1982. I had found Horst Degen, who survived the war. We'd exchanged extensive letters, and he had actually sent me a wonderful English language little essay he'd written about his experience. So the Ledger Star newspaper printed this 3-part series about how U-701 tipped it around the little patrol boat, dropped the mines, and then safely got back out to sea. Well, the next day I was sitting at my desk in Norfolk when my phone rang, and this elderly gentleman came on the line. He started berating me viciously. "You stupid reporter, you don't know anything. You got it all wrong." And I said, whoa. Slow down, sir. Tell me my mistake. He said, "Well, I was in that patrol boat, and I didn't see a thing."
That's just the point. That's a riot. The patrol boat skipper read your article in the 1980s.
He was right bothered. The other positive feedback is I got a note from the chairman of my communications company, Landmark, which owned and he thank you for answering a mystery I've always wondered about. It turns out he was a 15-year-old boy swimming in the water when the first ship mine went off, and he said he could feel the shock waves hitting him in the body from the ship that was blown up 200 yards away from him. So it's a small world.
That's just amazing, yeah. And you point this out in the piece as the beachgoers, like the fellow you talked to, were there that day. Suddenly, these ships are exploding right before their very eyes. Their first thought is U-boat, correct, but they're also thinking torpedoes. But this was like a whole new approach, the mine laying thing. And if it had really panned out better, if they'd planned it more, this could have really been disastrous. If they'd really gotten every major port of the East Coast with the mines, there was a lot of potential there that was shown at the mouth of the Chesapeake that day. And I feel like they could have done a lot more with that if they'd had the will to do it.
Well, people in 1942 probably didn't know about it because of censorship, and people in 2022 probably don't know about it because it's ancient history. But the Germans actually did a very ambitious mining campaign against the British Isles right at the outset of the war. And they used airplanes, surface ships, some U-boats, and they sank, I think, a good 3 or 4 dozen ships at about all those seaports around Scotland and England. So it does work if you do it correctly. But this was essentially, I think, one last slap in the face before he redeployed his U-boat force back out to what they call the North Atlantic convoy routes, which is like from Halifax up towards Newfoundland, up towards Iceland, and then over towards the northern approaches to the United Kingdom. That was the main target area for most of the war because that's where all the merchant ships taking supplies to England were going, was along that northern route. So this was a phased chapter in the conflict, and it was a pretty vicious one. I was always surprised at how little people knew about this, and then I learned, just as I said, about how effective the censorship was in World War II. The Navy was not at its best. I mean, they as they say, they finally learned how to do it right, and did drive the U-boats back out to sea, but there was a high price to pay. and the reason we knew very little about it for years and years is that um, genuine military secrets, as well as genuine military screw-ups, all came under the same censorship cloak.
Right. You know, it's important, I think, for everybody to be reminded of this chapter of World War II frequently. When we think of the war at sea, in that war where Americans, their minds go to the Pacific. Our last podcast episode was about the Battle of Midway, it's having its 80th anniversary this month, and you know, obviously that's where the American memory goes to. But this should be more well remembered because really this is the closest World War II came to us geographically, isn't it? I mean, they're just
Pretty
right.
much. Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty much. There was one delicious episode out in California, I'm sure you know about. This German submarine or Japanese submarine, R-19, had a big, powerful deck gun. He comes up into the Santa Barbara Channel and starts shooting at this oil refinery kind of up by Santa Barbara, California. And it's real choppy water, and you know his gunners aren't that good. And I don't think a single shell actually hit the oil tank farm. Most of them splashed into the water or thumped into the side of the cliff. But as I found out later, this had a connection to my story about U-701 because it caused such a panic in LA that you know they had headlines in newspapers you could read 100 yards away without even having to buy it. They thought it was the end of the world. You know, and after Pearl Harbor, I guess nerves were kind of frayed. But 2 days later, this Army patrol plane came flying down from Sacramento to Riverside on a long distance navigation exercise. And the Army unit back in Sacramento forgot to tell Southern California that this plane was coming down there. And this is like a day or two after the Japanese submarine had shelled the refinery. So suddenly they had an unidentified airplane coming in from the sea on radar. Well, he managed to land safely without being shot down. But about 8 hours later, every anti-aircraft gun from San Diego to Central California was on combat alert. Nerves were frayed. One guy fired off a shell, and everybody fired. It was like the field of Camlin. The sky is full of rounds and tracers and bullets. And unfortunately, you know, as the old song goes, what goes up must come down. And so these gunners just shelled the living devil out of Southern California. A couple of people died. They ended up calling it the Battle of Los Angeles. Well, the poor Army flyer who inadvertently set this off later came east, was assigned to a base down, which is now Cherry Point Marine Corps Air Station. And it was him and his aircrew that 3 weeks after U-701 successfully mined the Chesapeake Bay, this aircrew was on patrol off Cape Hatteras, surprised the U-boat on the surface and sank it. It was the first time an Army aircraft had successfully sunk a German U-boat.
U-701 was.
The A-29 Lockheed aircraft sank U-701, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the price that U-701 paid for its successful mining of the mouth of the Chesapeake. They didn't live to tell the tale much longer after, did they? How many days later was that when they were sunk by the aircraft?
Oh, they were sunk on July 7th. And there's a very tragic sea story that devolved from that. When the plane hit U-701 with a depth charge, it was at the very stern of the U-boat. They did a crash dive, but it was only 100 feet of water. So they came to the bottom, but they were flooding. German submariners were very well trained in escape and safety. And all but a handful did get out of the U-boat and successfully made it up to the surface, including Commander Deggan. Most of them had little life flotation gear, but not all. Once Lieutenant Kane and his aircrew saw that they had sunk the U-boat and they saw these people popping to the surface, as Lieutenant Kane said in a memoir, he said, I suddenly realized these weren't the enemy anymore. They were some helpless men in the water. So instead of just flying away, he circled at low altitude, and he ordered his crewmen to throw out the big life raft that the plane had, plus their own flotation life jackets, and they threw them down to the poor Germans in the water. They tried unsuccessfully to get ships or airplanes to come out and help rescue these guys. There was radio static or problems of communication. Finally, they had to fly back. They were running out of gas. They flew back to North Carolina, and to his fury, Kane found that nobody believed him when he reported he sunk a U-boat. They just said, "Oh, you're making it up. You couldn't have done that." Well, anyway, they belatedly got a search underway for these guys, but they didn't count on the Gulf Stream. And it took 2 days to find them. And when they finally came upon the survivors, there were only 7 of these guys left. The rest had all drowned. They were retrieved by a Navy, seaplane, and off to captivity for the rest of the war.
You know, you hear this kind of aftermath stories, and it gives you hope for humanity. They're the enemy until they're in need of your help, and then they're just somebody that is a person in need. And I know it was that way with kamikaze pilots. We would pull them out of the water, and they were incredulous, like, "Why are you doing this?" but well, we have a question that's come by a viewer, so let's get that on here. Okay, well, okay, here's one. There's a sort of an applied history question to throw at you here, Ed. What are the lessons from this conflict for the Black Sea and South China Sea? That sounds like a broad brush question about the wars in general, but maybe if there's a sub component to that question you can think of. It's
Well, I would say that submarines are more important than ever. I would say that if China invades Taiwan, I don't think it's going to help the foreign trade situation. So I don't think there's going to be too much of a need for convoys. I might be wrong on that. But essentially, the root lesson is the United States Navy in the year or two before Pearl Harbor was just a tiny shadow of what it would become to be. But it takes time, effort, money, and sweat to forge an effective, combat capable Navy out of a peacetime group of happy-go-lucky sailors. It took 6 months of really grueling work before the U.S. Navy, the Atlantic Fleet, learned how to attack, sink, and essentially thwart U-boat attacks. And it was by the skin of their fingernails the whole time, because every other theater in the war was competing for resources. Just one quick example. One of the vital tools in the ultimate defeat of the U-boat was called the VLR Liberator. This is a B-24 land-based 4-engine bomber that was converted for extra long-range patrols by essentially adding fuel tanks to where one of their bomb bays was. And it gave it the range to fly way out in the Atlantic, linger, and then come back. Until that plane was available in strength to the Allies, particularly the Royal Air Force, the Germans had this huge area of the Atlantic that they called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, where the ships that were out there were under no protection, or no airplanes could get to them to safeguard them, and it was easy pickings. It took 2.5 years, I think, for the RAF finally to get enough of these planes. I think we're talking maybe a dozen or two, to go out and close that air gap. When they did that, the defeat of the U-boats was preordained, but it took them mostly struggling against their colleagues in the Royal Air Force who wanted to use those planes to bomb Berlin, or in the American Army Air Forces who wanted to use those planes, in their bombing campaigns. And nobody wanted to take this scarce amount of planes and give them to the people who needed it the most. So the general lesson I would say is, I don't care how many ships or airplanes or submarines you've got in the Western Pacific or capable of patrolling out there, but unless they know what they're doing, it's going to be like early 42. You're going to have a bloodbath, and not a very good one.
Yeah, maybe that's the most sobering takeaway, right? The great sort of narrative arc of the Navy in World War II is how they had a learning curve and they had to pick things up and fix their mistakes and rise to the occasion in a hurry, and that they did. It's one of the most heroic aspects of it is how they improved on the fly in the thick of it. You know, they had to like get better, and they did. But you have to wonder in the current battle space, is there going to be that kind of time for a learning curve? I mean, we turn it around relatively quickly by like say Pacific War standards in the 40s, um, where you know you can look back a year and we've got it together so much more than we had a year earlier. But if things got hot today, is there going to be that kind of learning curve? You've got cyber, you've got all sorts of things that are much more real time. Everything's more real time now. So that's kind
Well,
of
I would be a little more positive because the environment out there in the Taiwan Straits area and the South China Sea, if you read your daily US&I newsfeed, our ships and carriers and submarines, they're not just hanging around in Port on Liberty. Um, I remember when the Nimitz came back last year from its extended, they called it the COVID deployment, coming and going to the Middle East. They stopped in the South China Sea with another carrier, I think the Roosevelt the first time and the Reagan the second time, and they put together a two-carrier combat arms formation and went steaming into the waters that China says, hey, that belongs to us now. And they were saying, excuse me, no, it doesn't. So I would say I'm a lot more positive about the readiness and the overall technical capabilities because the peacetime operations out there now are being conducted with a sureness that at any moment it could become a conflict. I mean, it's getting pretty dicey out there with China's behavior.
right. China's sub fleet, which has been growing, they've got stealth capabilities and whatnot that are cause for concern. And I know that our folks are staying up late at night analyzing all that sort of thing. But let's just hope it's all hypothetical and remains so. But I agree with you. It seems like with each passing year or month, it seems like more dicey, as you put it. So,
Well, I had a good friend, Admiral Joe Pruer, who later became U.S. ambassador to China. He was SINCPAC, which is now INDOPAC, back when I was at Seattle working at the newspaper there. And I remember he gave a speech one night and he said, we don't have to worry about China. Our grandchildren will be working the China problem. Oh, I just noticed something. I think the grandchildren here talking about are now in their first term enlistments in the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and Army. So, you know, the time
yikes,
is nigh.
yikes. Well, let's hope he was off by a generation or so or whatever. But yeah. As a side note, the Naval Institute published Admiral Prier's oral history just very recently in the last couple of years. So that's out there, folks. If anyone's interested in it, you're right. There's a lot of good China insight that he had to bring from his career, his sort of two-track career. Well, so you got to know by correspondence Captain Hans Dagen of the skipper of the U-701. What was that like?
Do I have enough time to tell you a really brief anecdote about the miracle of journalism now?
Please do.
I had a unique problem. Usually, you start to write a nonfiction history of something that happened a long time ago, and the single hardest thing is to get contemporaneous descriptions, quotes, accounts, the narrative of a story. Well, I had a completely different situation. In 1982, I'd interviewed both Lieutenant Kane, the guy who sank U-701, and Horst Degen, the commander, at length, and had this story of this momentous, 3-week period in June of 42. Well, come 2011, excuse me, my book editor said, we could maybe make a book out of what happened back then. Being focused as a journalist, I didn't go and ask the biographical, where were you as a kid? Where'd you go to school? What was your mom like? Filler questions that give you the full three-dimensional portrait of a character in a book. And these guys, alas, had long since passed away. So I was, racking my brains of how am I going to fill the book. All I got is a 30-inch newspaper article. Well, I know a guy up in Canada who runs one of the most marvelous historical archives on U-boats. It's called uboatarchive.net. His name is Jerry Mason. He's a retired U.S. naval aviator, lifelong fascination with history. And he has this incredible website where he actually gets the German language patrol reports, each U-boat, and he translates them into English and posts them online. So I had used him in my previous book and knew him quite well, and I thought maybe he can give me some advice. I called Jerry up. I said, here's the situation. I need to write a book about two guys I knew 40 years ago that have both died. I said, I don't know how to do it. Do you have any ideas? And he said, which U-boat is it? And I said, it's the U-boat that mined Chesapeake Bay in 1942. And he goes, oh, U-701. Uh-huh. And I found myself looking at my phone going, Jerry, there were 812 German U-boats commissioned in World War II. You cannot have memorized the names of the captains of every one of them. And he goes, no. His son Gunther is a good friend of mine. Tell you what, I'll send him a text. Maybe he'll give you a call. An hour and a half later, his deceased heroic German U-boats commander's son calls me out of the blue from Dusseldorf. And we started talking. We talked like 2 hours. And he went back through his father's files. And what sealed the deal for him was he found some letters I'd written, Horst Deggen, 4 decades ago. So he knew I wasn't a crank, or at least not that kind of a crank. Anyway, because of that and an amazing researcher I had, I was able to actually find material at Horst Deggen's personal and his personal life that made this a 3-dimensional book instead of just a remashed article. So, and by the way, the other thing I found out is that everything is in the National Archives. I had a wonderful researcher. When Horst Deggen was taken POW, he was locked away in Arizona, and as a matter of policy, Navy Intel would always put U-boat people from different U-boats together, and then they wiretapped their little rooms, and they had guys with earphones taking dictation 24/7. And so, over the course of his 4 years as a POW, he talked to these guys about his early life, what they did, how they did it, and all these transcripts are in the National Archives. Even Gunther Deggen, Horst's son, didn't know about this, and my researcher found them. I had conversations from when he was a cadet.
That's
so
great.
Life is good.
Well, you're describing the hunting and gathering phase of historical research, which is really where that's the most fun part, isn't it? The thrill of discovery.
When you find
But
it.
yeah, I just want to add to your shout out for uboatarchive.net to anyone out there interested. That is just like a lodestone of primary source info on U-boats, World War II. It's just a phenomenal resource. And yes, it's definitely something that anybody interested in this should check out. So what was Dagan like when you talked to him in the 80s? He would have been what, in his 60s then, or something like that, or
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, he was in his upper 60s. He got out of POW camp. He didn't get home to Germany until 1946. There were, I think at the time, over 20,000 German POWs, a small number of which were U-boat people. So it took a while to process. He got back to his hometown in outside of Hamburg. He met a widow whose husband had been killed in the Russian front in the German army, and they got married. And he worked for, I think, 20 years for the Ford Motor Company in one of their distributorships. He was never a Hollywood version of a stiff upper lip, heel clicking Nazi. The German Navy wasn't like that. Hitler used to say he had the Nazi Air Force, the indifferent army, and the Christian Navy, because the Navy had traditions that predated the Nazis' rise to power, and they did their duty, but they weren't too happy with Hitler. He was a very big fan of the United States and England. He just found himself, fighting on the other side.
That's amazing. It's amazing to think that that recently, well, I say recently, that sounds not recent to some people who weren't even born then, but you could still talk to the World War II guys in the 1980s. You know, they're still around, and it just makes you realize what a loss that is that the generation gradually dissipates year by year.
Yeah.
I doubt any of them are left now. From as far as U-boat, there might be some out there, but it's just phenomenal that not that long ago you still have that tangible living link to these great events of history early on. Well, your specialty is this field. I invite you to give us a hint of anything you might be working on presently.
Well, actually, I'm taking a long hot summer off, and I'm working on a kind of a family history that has nothing to do with the military, except my family's been in the military since the Revolutionary War. So I guess it's sort of a more of a historical who did what, when, where. I uh, I just found out. I did not know this until 2 years ago. My father had a first cousin, but it's a branch of the family that had just floated away from ours, and they'd lost contact. And he was killed by a German U-boat. He was an Army sergeant in a division coming ashore at Normandy in Christmas Eve of 1944. So this is around the time of the Battle of the Bulge. You know, the Normandy invasion was long over, but his troop ship was the Leopoldville, which is a certain infamous incident because so many people died. It was torpedoed in the Bay of the Seine, and I think over 500 or 600 uh, passengers on board, perished, including himself. I didn't even know he existed, and I found out he actually there was an article in the New York Times about him because he was from a branch of the family that had become prominent up in Brooklyn. A bunch of Yankees. Anyway,
Well, here you go, Ed. You take a break from U-boat history research to do a family history, and a U-boat history comes roaring back in your face again. That's a fascinating thing to coincidentally find out.
I guess I'm just doomed.
Well, what do you think are some of the aspects of the U-boat war that we could learn more about? I always like to think about how history's never done and all the history hasn't been written yet. I know the U-boat war has got a real sort of aficionado base, and with U-boatarchive.net probably being an epitome example of that level of granular fact gathering. But do you feel like there's any aspects of it that could bear to be explored more?
I think the broad
Provide.
outlines are pretty established now. But what amazes me is they keep coming upon incidents or events that were totally either suppressed by the censors or just overlooked by the people doing the reporting. I'm thinking of the U-boat they found off New Jersey not long ago, that wasn't supposed to be anywhere near there, the Shadow Divers boat. And then they found the U-boat off of New Orleans at the young reservist patrol boat saw an attack. He had like 3 depth charges, and he actually sank the boat. Didn't know he had. Um, Reported as a possible kill. And again, shooting the messenger. When he reported this, I wish I had his name at the tip of my tongue. Um, he was rebuked by his superiors because he was a lowly naval reservist, and actually they forced him to leave the patrol boat and take some non-essential shore job. And it wasn't until like 5 years ago that I don't know if it was Robert Ballard or another one of these research groups. They actually located the U-boat and confirmed that it had been sunk by a depth charge. And there was a great ceremony, I think, in the CNO's office in the Pentagon, Chief of Naval Operation, where they belatedly presented the guy's family members, his children and grandchildren, with a medal for his success in sinking a U-boat, for which he was fired from his job.
That's fantastic.
So
Time favors
how
the
that would go.
person who deserves, and that's another example of how there are a lot of lost stories out there from the U-boat war of World War II. And that reminded me of something I wanted to ask you earlier. The wreck of U-701. I mean, that's like a major. I mean, you're just north of the graveyard of the Atlantic, so called there. Has that wreck been sighted? Has it been dived on or? Yeah.
In fact, when I found out, I wrote my article in 1982. Some sport divers found it about 6 years later. And when I found out how they'd found it, I could have kicked myself because the evidence that led them to it was right in front of my face the whole time, too. Example, U-701 was patrolling off Cape Hatteras. I think they're a little bit north of it in July of 42. It was brutally hot because U-boats relied on the cold temperature of the ocean water to help keep them habitable. While they were patrolling in water that was 75 to 85 degrees, what that meant was the U-boat interior would be over 100, 110 degrees the whole time because of the machinery. And they were desperate to come up once a day, vent the boat, get fresh air in there, cool it off, and then go back down again until the nighttime when they could surface and go hunt for ships. So anyway, this afternoon in July of 42, he popped up to the surface. He didn't even come fully up. He just broached the surface with his conning tower, opened the main hatch, started the diesels, sucking cold air in through the hatchway. Meanwhile, his lookouts are supposed to be looking for airplanes, and one of them was daydreaming. And that's how Lieutenant Harry Kane and his aircrew got in and bombed them. One of the things that he remembered was right before that happened, they were on a course of 270, and their lookout had reported seeing a half-sunken merchant ship with two masts poking up out of the water. It was just, in shallow water. And he, for some reason, remembered that. Years later, the guy, I forget his name, Lewis was his name, asked Horst Dagan for any information he had on where the U-boat might be. And Dagan sent him that information that they were heading right for a ship that had two masts sticking out of the water. And then everything, went chaotic. So he did his research, and he found a shipwreck that looked like the wreck that Dagan's lookouts had seen. There was two masts, and there's, half sunken water. It was north of Cape Hatteras. So they chartered a boat with a little side scanning sonar. They went up to the wreck, did a reciprocal course, went back down the track, and found U-701 on the first try.
Wow. So Dagan had the coordinates all along with those two masts poking up. Isn't that something?
I didn't know anything about sonar then, but when I read the page, I went, I could have found a U-boat.
Do you dive? Do you do wreck dives?
No, that's one reason I did not find the U-boat. I do not wreck dive.
Well, I know that's the mecca for wreck divers along that coast there. Well, Ed, it's always great to have you on here, and I hope we can have you on here again sometime in the future. Our guest has been Ed Offley, author of The Burning Shore and other books on the U-boat war, and author of When War Erupted Off Virginia Beach in the current June issue of Naval History Magazine. I want to thank you all for joining us again today for the Naval History Podcast. And I invite you to become part of the discussion. We like having questions during the podcast. It's always fun. And on the larger scale of becoming part of the discussion and the conversation of all these things we've been talking about, I invite you, if you aren't already, to join the Naval Institute. Membership comes with a lot of rewards, including being on the cutting edge of all the current debates about the present and future fleet and the geopolitical situation it will face, and looking back on the heritage of our Navy as well through Naval History Magazine and other initiatives. It's all there if you join the Naval Institute. And there's the prompt right there. You can see it. So please join us again next time. I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine, and we will see you soon, hopefully. Take care.